Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 8 of my Empire vs. Goa'uld matchup. That is the Galactic Empire from Star Wars just prior to the Battle of Endor, versus the Goa'uld from Stargate just prior to the defeat of Ra, though they'll still get access to all their tech. Basically, I'm setting it in that time frame so that all the system lords are actually united. This section will at long last be where I give my conclusions on which side wins in a variety of different matchup scenarios. Also, I have a coffee link in the description, and I have officially launched my merch store through Fourth Wall. There's a link to that as well in the description, and I want to give a huge thank you to my friend Tyler, who put the designs together for me. If you like his work, then I've got his email on the store page right at the bottom, so you can either give him a friendly kudos, or you can commission him to do some work for you if you'd like. Before we get started, I want to address an issue that I keep running across with regard to Goa'uld shielding. The main example everyone seems to reference in regard to how powerful the shields are is from Season 2, Episode 1, where a pair of Hatak ships apparently tank hits from a pair of Naquadah-enhanced Goa'uld Buster nukes, which each have a yield of about a gigaton. This is then used as a benchmark, and if true, that means that turbolasers are just incapable of harming Hatak shields because they demonstrably don't even have anywhere close to that kind of yield. With the pushback I've received over my conclusion that neither nuke actually detonated and merely impacted the shields, and relatively small explosions we see are just leftover rocket fuel burning up, I decided to rewatch the episode in question again just to make sure I'm not missing anything. In short, this episode is a mess, especially when compared to the rest of the series. So here's what we know. The staff weapons on Hatak are capable of overwhelming the shields and destroying other Hatak vessels. We see a couple examples of orbital bombardment, in particular in the Continuum movie, where Washington, D.C. is bombarded from orbit. Each of the hits is approximately the size of a city block or two, so it's reasonable to assume that each of these hits is approximately a couple kilotons. They're definitely not even close to gigaton yield, as each hit at that yield would have an 8-kilometer diameter fireball and an even bigger blast radius. Really, they wouldn't so much bombard DC as just one-shot the whole thing with that kind of yield. So, looking back at the Season 2 episode, there's some weirdness going on. For one, the fireballs we see aren't consistent with nuclear detonations at all. But this could just be a special effects gaffe. For another, nukes don't generally detonate on impact, they detonate by proximity. And nobody on Earth anticipated the shield, so the nukes were intercepted prematurely. But they could have set them up to detonate on impact, so this one's a bit of a wash. Finally, if there was a pair of gigantic nuclear detonations like that, we'd expect that there'd be a giant flash, and the resulting EMP would disrupt all sensors, so getting a read on anything would be really difficult, since they'd need to wait until they could get everything back online before seeing anything. But they do get to see everything that happens in real time, and NASA is able to confirm that the nukes didn't reach their targets. Oh, but wait! Later, prior to the destruction of both ships via some SG-1 sabotage, General Hammond is on the phone with the president and talks about how there has been an EMP which is disrupting things. What? So your sensors worked long enough to tell you about the situation there and then failed afterward because of an EMP which propagates at light speed? Okay, a conventional explosion wouldn't cause an EMP, certainly not anyone would care about. The shields themselves don't seem to generate an EMP effect. The Goa'uld hadn't yet fired a shot, so that can't be it. The nukes must have gone off, right? But wait, the sensors worked fine to tell everyone exactly what was going on right up until they apparently forgot about that part so Hammond could talk with the president. Alright, it's settled. There's only two possibilities here. Either Goa'uld shields are hyper-resistant to nukes for some reason while being quite vulnerable to plasma weapons, like their standard-issue staff weapons, or the nukes never went off and the whole episode is just a mess. In any case, I'm quite confident in claiming that turbolasers and staff weapons are in the same ballpark of power, though shot for shot I'd have to still say that staff weapons hit a bit harder. Not multiple orders of magnitude harder, but maybe up to twice as hard. Alright. On to the matchups. First things first, I want to review the different kinds of matchups I'll be talking about. They are 1v1 ship, fleet versus fleet, soldier versus soldier, army versus army, and galactic domination. For the galactic domination comparison, I'll be coming at it in two ways. One, where each side starts with basically nothing and has to spread across the galaxy, which will be best for representing overall mobility and industrial capacity over the course of years. And the Worlds Collide scenario, where I just take the respective galaxies of each side with all their territory intact and just smash them together and see what happens. If you watch the rest of the series, you'll know that I have no intention of being exhaustive with my analysis, merely representative. So I didn't, and won't, talk about every single type of unit on either side. Just enough to give them a good idea of what each side can actually do, So while you're all welcome to bring up questions about why I didn't bring up your favorite variety of TIE fighter, that's why. There's just too much for me to cover every single thing involved in any mashup. Kosher? Cool. On to the matchups. Starting with the Hatak Pyramid ship versus the Imperial II Star Destroyer. Both ships have comparable weapon ranges, and their weapons hit comparably hard, though I think I'd still give the edge to the Hatak in terms of individual weapons. Defensively, I'd actually give it to the Imperial II, in particular because they actually believe in installing armor on their ships. Though there's a bit of a trade-off because it's pretty clear that the Hatak is faster at sublight. The Hatak also requires less crew to be combat effective, but when it comes down to it, the iconic pyramid ship is just plain outclassed by the Imperial II. The speed advantage doesn't actually matter in a slugging match since their ranges are so similar, and while individual staff cannons are probably more powerful than individual turbolasers, a given Hatak has a whopping 60 staff cannons distributed around its perimeter, which means it can't use all of them at once, at least against a single target. Meanwhile, the Imperial II has 60 turbolasers, 60 heavy ion cannons, 8 octuple turbolaser barbettes, 4 on each side for broadsiding, and 6 dual concussion missile turrets. Combine this with the fact that the triangular shape of the Imperial II allows them to target all their weapons but the barbettes on a single target if they're facing their target, and then half as many in a broadsiding situation. Combine all that with the comparable shielding but much heavier armor of the Imperial II, and I think it's pretty clear they would just absolutely shred a Hatak. We should also look at the fighter and bomber complements on each side. Each Imperial II carries 48 TIE fighters, 12 TIE bombers, and 12 TIE interceptors, which are basically just TIEs but better in every way. Meanwhile, the Hatak carries 12 wings of Death Gliders and 3 wings of Alkesh bombers. It's a bit unclear what a wing is in this context, but typically that refers to a group of 12. So that means 144 Death Gliders and 36 bombers, heavily outnumbering the Imperials, at least in terms of fighter-bomber complement. So which side has the better fighters and bombers? Well, there's a mix. For the fighters, I think it's pretty clear the Death Gliders with their inertial drives can move and maneuver faster than TIEs both in space and atmosphere, but they also struggle to shoot down modern aircraft because their staff cannons just fire so slowly. I'd still argue that their cannons hit harder than TIE blasters, but neither fighter is shielded, so any hit would be lethal, and the TIE fires in bursts, making it easier to hit anything. So yeah, who wins? Well, one-on-one, the TIE fighter. Easy. Death Gliders are much faster, but they still maneuver as if they're in atmosphere all the time, just like the TIEs, and they'll have a really hard time actually hitting anything. Lumped in with the capital ships, can the 48 TIEs plus 12 interceptors handle the 2.4 to 1 odds of trying to go after the Hatak complement? Doubtful. TIEs are definitely better, but they're not that much better. Moving on to the bombers, Alkesh are just better than TIE bombers in every way but versatility of weapons. The TIEs can drop anything from thermal detonators to fusion bombs, and Alkesh just drop plasma charges. Aside from that, the Alkesh have hyperdrives, so they're fairly independent. They also have heavy staff cannons on a turret, so they're better at protecting themselves. They have cloaking devices, and they even have shields, which the TIE bombers don't. Combine that with the fact that the Hatak carries 3 times as many Alkesh as the Imperial II does bombers, and the capital ship matchup gets a little more dicey. Hatak are called motherships for a reason, and in a fight between a solo Imperial II and its full complement, and a solo Hatak and its full complement, I think it's pretty clear that the Goa'uld complement would wipe out the Imperial complement, leaving the Alkesh to just absolutely ravage the Imperial II, turning the tide in favor of the Hatak. I know, I'm pretty surprised too. This fight has really ended up being a lot more even than I thought. So this changes things when we get into fleet versus fleet. Remember, the largest fleet we get to see in SG-1 was Ball's fleet of 50 ships, and if we're very generous and combine all dozen or so System Lords fleets, and despite the fact that Ball was very much on top of it at the time, we'll just give them each 50 ships so they can bring to the fight for a total of 600 ships that could optimistically be brought together for a fight. We'll match this giant Goa'uld fleet, which, by the way, has zero precedent and zero reason to assume they could actually get that big, against an Imperial fleet. And if we go by Battle of Endor numbers, they'd only have about 30 Star Destroyers, along with a variety of support craft and one Super Star Destroyer. And a Death Star, of course. The thing is, as I mentioned in the numbers section, this fleet was all that could reasonably be assembled in secret. So the rebels, with their fairly robust intelligence gathering capabilities, wouldn't catch on to what was going on. A much better measure would be looking at the Battle of Coruscant from the Revenge of the Sith, where over 1,000 Venator-class Star Destroyers joined the battle, in addition to other ships. So swap Venators for Imperial Series Star Destroyers, and I think that would be a much more reasonable representation of a real concerted effort by the Imperials. They'd, of course, have a variety of smaller support vessels as well. So, a highly optimistic upper limit estimate of 600 Ha'tak vessels, plus their Death Gliders and Al-Kash bombers, against 1,000 Imperial Star Destroyers, plus their support ships, plus their own fighter bomber complements. I don't think the Goa'uld are winning that. They're just so heavily outnumbered. They're like the 2-to-1 odds go away in terms of fighter complement, because suddenly you have twice as many Imperial ships, and their fighters are better, their bombers aren't better, but once you've gotten rid of the escort fighters, you can take out the bombers just fine. Yeah, it would be a bloodbath. Moving on, let's look at ground forces. 1v1, Stormtrooper versus Jaffa. The Stormtrooper has better kit in terms of general gadgets. Staff weapons and blasters are both wildly inconsistent in terms of damage, but at the high end of what we see staff weapons do, we get to see them hitting like grenades, far beyond what standard E11 blasters can do. That said, neither Jaffa nor Stormtroopers have armor that provides much protection, so both weapons should be plenty lethal to the other side. Where Jaffa and Stormtroopers differ the most in terms of what the soldiers can do themselves. Stormtroopers, at least in the time frame we're talking about, are just normal dudes. Jaffa are all superhuman in strength, endurance, and regenerative capabilities, thank you to their Goa'uld symbiotes. Taken all together, I think the grunt soldiers go pretty much even, but the Jaffa have a bit of an edge. Really, though, both soldiers are pretty awful, all things considered. Neither have armor that would be particularly effective against the weapons being used, though I will say that if they manage to get into melee combat, Jaffa warriors would just absolutely wreck multiple Stormtroopers. Moving on up to the best of the best on each side, and we get a System Lord versus Darth Vader. And, the System Lords would get really, really wrecked. Sure, they have personal shields, but those don't work against a lightsaber since it would be moving relatively slowly. And sure, the Goa'uld are superhuman and their Karakash gauntlets give them a ton of fun toys, but Vader has a lightsaber and the Force. I'm pretty sure he could take on all 12 of the Major Lords all at once and win without breaking a sweat. Let's move on up to Army versus Army. Each Imperial II carries a garrison of 9,700 Stormtroopers, 20 AT-AT Walkers, and 30 AT-STs. Each Ha'tak carries around 2,000 Jaffa warriors and no armored vehicles. There are Jaffa armored vehicles, but they don't seem to see much action, so I'm not going to put too much weight behind them. Yeah, the Goa'uld don't stand any chance in army combat. Finally, let's look at the Galactic scenario, starting with the blank galaxy scenario, where each side starts with a minimal territory and must expand toward each other. For the sake of making sure that we keep things interesting, we'll assume that there are stargates on every inhabitable planet. Here's how I see this going down. The System Lords would rapidly leverage their knowledge of the stargates to set up mining colonies across the galaxy, staffed by their standard slave laborers. The Empire would pursue their standard doctrine of building a ton of giant ships as soon as possible, and begin mapping out hyperspace lanes, but when they figure out the stargates, they'd start setting up mine colonies of their own, operated by droid labor. Very quickly, in stellar terms, the Empire would start to outscale the System Lords. Neither side would probably do much innovating, as their goals are more aligned with maintaining control rather than trying to enrich their own civilization. The thing is, the Goa'uld are quite content to just rule over a bunch of feudal colonies who mine using picks and hammers, whereas the Empire is more inclined to leverage their technology. The thing about the Empire, and really Star Wars in general, is that their tech is very lived in. Nobody thinks twice about having near-sentient droids, hovering vehicles, and hyperdrive-capable ships that are just in junkyards. They're just mundane. Common stuff, like having a microwave, or a car, or television. I predict that the Empire would view stargates as a great asset for logistics and control, but they love their big toys, so they'd still build tons of Star Destroyers and even a Death Star. Years of expansion later, the two factions would encounter each other and the fighting would begin. Very rapidly, the fight would go against the Goa'uld. They would simply be massively outproduced, and even if on an individual level they're not being outgunned, really, the Empire just produces so much war material, even while at peace. The Goa'uld would undoubtedly try to infest some Imperials with symbiotes, and would undoubtedly be successful in doing so, but the intel that they gained would be basically useless. On a technological level, the System Lords are generally actually more advanced than the Empire. Their hyperdrives are a little bit slower, but far less limited. Their weapons hit harder individually. They have teleporters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What they don't have is massive infrastructure, and that's not something you can just start doing after a war has broken out. There's just too much catch-up to do. Also, scaling like that, infrastructure like that, that's not a technology thing, it's a mentality thing. The Goa'uld would love to get a hold of a Force user, but no Force sensitive on the level of Vader or Palpatine would be particularly vulnerable to the symbiotes, since they'd be able to sense them sneaking up, and even if infected, the Battle of Wills would probably not go in the symbiote's favor. It's really hard to say. Lesser Force users would be pretty formidable as hosts, but they simply wouldn't be able to contribute much in the grand scheme of things. On the other side, the Empire would love to get a hold of ring transporter technology, and even Naquita would be an amazing resource for the Empire. The relatively tiny amount of Naquita that makes up a Stargate is sufficient to create a wormhole to anywhere in the galaxy. It's crazy powerful stuff. Way beyond the demonstrated power of the stuff like coaxium we see in the Solo movie. Imperial intelligence would just have a field day. Pivoting a bit to the colliding galaxy scenario, where both sides start with all their territory and somehow get smashed together, nothing changes. I do think that a fair number of Imperial worlds would get ravaged by deliveries of Naquita bombs through their Stargates, but the simple solution would just simply be to re-bury the things after discovering them. Assuming, of course, that they don't figure out an Iris device. Based on what we see from the Empire, I'm inclined to think that if they did figure out an Iris device, it would take a while. So they'd lose out on some logistics, but they'd cope just fine with their normal shipping. Their hyperdrives are plenty fast. But in the grand scheme of things, the system lords would suffer loss after loss after loss as the Empire threw thousands and thousands of Star Destroyers at them. The Goa'uld would also have basically no answer to the Death Star, so it would just be able to go from important Goa'uld world to important Goa'uld world and just blow them up. And there we have it! Basically, on the small scale, the Goa'uld fare really well, actually, winning 1v1 ship, at least if they get their full fighter complement, and soldier versus soldier matchups, but in larger conflicts, they just get overwhelmed. The power gap between their individual units just isn't large enough to allow the Goa'uld and their Jaffa to take on, at minimum, 2-to-1 odds. The Goa'uld would also be less equipped to replace losses since their ships aren't built at shipyards, but instead on the surface of a few planets, again, by slave labor. But what do you all think? Am I overstating the Empire's industrial capabilities? Do you think that I'm wrong about any of the matchups? Let me know in the comments. Again, I have links to my Ko-fi account and my merch store if you want to support the channel in the description, and you can get an awesome t-shirt. And until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.